The rain didn't feel like water anymore. It felt like 1,000 needles stitching Iva Brighton's skin to the cold pavement. She lay in the narrow, trash-strewn alleyway, the metallic tang of blood filling her mouth. Just moments ago, the air had been thick with the sound of laughter, the cruel, jagged kind that only comes from those who find pleasure in breaking someone else. They had called her names that were meant to strip her of her dignity before they used their fists to finish the job. Iva pressed her palm into the wet asphalt, her fingers curling around a discarded soda can. Every breath was a battle against a sharp, stabbing pain in her ribs. Her white shirt, once crisp and professional, was now a ruin of silk and grime, clinging to her bruised shoulders like a second, damaged skin. She waited for the familiar urge to crawl away, to hide in the shadows until the world felt safe again. That had been her pattern: endure, retreat, and disappear. But as she stared at a muddy puddle reflecting the flickering neon sign of a nearby bodega, something shifted. The reflection showed a woman with a swollen lip and a hematoma blooming across her cheek, but the eyes, dark and burning, belonged to someone Iva didn't recognize. The fear that usually lived in the pit of her stomach had been cauterized by a sudden, white-hot flash of rage. She wasn't just tired of the bullying, she was tired of the silence that followed it. With a low, guttural groan, Iva pushed herself up. Her knees wobbled, threatening to buckle under the weight of her exhaustion, but she forced them to lock. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled cloth, pressing it against the gash on her forehead with a trembling hand. She didn't look back at the darkness of the alley where her attackers had vanished. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the main road. The city hummed with an indifferent energy, the distant glow of headlights cutting through the downpour. Usually, Iva would have taken the back streets, slipping through the gloom to avoid being seen in this state. Not tonight. Tonight, the shame didn't belong to her. She stepped out of the mouth of the alley and onto the main rain-slicked boulevard. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and pained, but she didn't falter. She reached the center of the asphalt, the yellow lines beneath her feet blurred by the rushing water. She stopped right there, in the path of the oncoming world. She was done running, done hiding, and done being an invisible casualty of someone else's malice. As the distant, low vibration of heavy engines began to grow louder, Iva squared her shoulders and waited. If the world wanted to crush her, it would have to look her in the eye while doing it. The distant hum of the city was suddenly swallowed by a deeper, more predatory sound, the rhythmic, synchronized growl of high-performance engines. Rounding the corner of the darkened boulevard, a line of 6 identical black sedans appeared, moving with the precision of a funeral procession and the speed of an incoming storm. Their headlights weren't the warm yellow of the street lamps. They were piercing, clinical blue LEDs that sliced through the driving rain, turning the falling water into sparks of cold fire. Eva didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the lane, her feet planted firmly on the double yellow line. The glare of the lead car's lights hit her directly, illuminating the crimson stains on her white shirt and the jagged cut on her brow. To anyone else, she would have looked like a ghost, a broken thing haunting the asphalt. But as the convoy bore down on her, she didn't see vehicles. She saw a wall of metal that expected her to vanish. Before I tell you what happened next to Eva, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's dive into it.
The air suddenly shrieked. The lead driver slammed on the brakes, the specialized tires fighting the slick surface of the road. The car fishtailed slightly, its massive frame heavy with armor, before coming to a dead stop barely 3 feet from where Eva stood. Behind it, the other 5 cars halted in perfect unison, their proximity so close they looked like a single segmented shadow. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of cooling metal and the heavy rhythmic swish of windshield wipers. Through the tinted glass of the lead car, Eva could feel the weight of several dozen eyes staring at her. She didn't move. She didn't lower the cloth from her forehead. She simply stared back at the dark windshield, her reflection a pale, trembling blur against the polished black hood. In the second car, the air was pressurized and silent. The driver's hands tightened on the leather steering wheel. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror. He waited for a signal, a command to move the obstacle by any means necessary. The bodyguards in the passenger seats shifted, their hands moving instinctively toward the holsters hidden beneath their sharp lapels. They were men paid to remove threats, and to them, anything that stopped the convoy was a threat. But the signal didn't come. Instead, the rear door of the second sedan clicked open. The sound was small, but in the tense silence of the standoff, it rang out like a gunshot. A pair of handmade Italian leather shoes stepped out into the dirty street water. The heavy metal of the Mafia had come to a full stop, and the man at the center of it all was finally stepping into the light. Park Jae-hyun emerged with a terrifying grace, his sharp black suit absorbing the blue glare of the headlights. He didn't look like a man who had been inconvenienced. He looked like a predator who had found something curious in his path. Behind him, his bodyguards stepped out in a fluid, practiced motion, their emotionless faces forming a wall of living stone. They waited for his word to clear the road, to push this bloodied woman into the gutter where she seemingly belonged.
But as Jae-hyun took a step forward, his hand resting casually on the doorframe, the cold, unfazed expression he wore began to crack. He wasn't looking at the blood or the disheveled shirt. He was looking at the fire in Iva's eyes, and for the first time in a decade, the man who controlled the city felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The heavy door of the second sedan creaked open, a sound that seemed to reverberate against the silent buildings lining the boulevard. Park Jae-hyun stepped out, moving with a cold, liquid grace that commanded the very air around him. An aide immediately appeared at his side, holding a wide black umbrella to shield him from the downpour. But Jae-hyun didn't seem to notice the rain or the wind. His focus was entirely on the obstruction in the road. His expression was a mask of granite, the face of a man who had spent a lifetime ordering the removal of obstacles without a second thought. His bodyguards stood like statues, their hands poised near their jackets, awaiting the slight nod that would signal them to drag the woman into the shadows. Jae-hyun took 2 measured steps forward, his leather shoes splashing into the dark water. He was prepared to meet the eyes of a protester, a drunk, or a madwoman. He was prepared to use his voice, a low baritone that usually sent shivers through the city's underworld, to dismiss her existence. But as he drew closer, the clinical blue glare of the headlights fully illuminated Iva's face. The air left Jae-hyun's lungs in a sudden, silent rush. He stopped mid-stride, his hand twitching at his side. The mask of the ruthless mafia boss didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His skin, usually a healthy olive-toned bronze, turned a ghastly, translucent pale, making the dark ink of the tattoos creeping up his neck stand out in stark, violent relief. He didn't see the blood first, or even the bruised defiance in her stance. He saw the shape of her eyes and the specific curve of her jaw, features he had spent 15 years trying to convince himself were a fever dream. The umbrella in the aide's hand wavered as the man noticed his master's sudden instability. The stoic bodyguards exchanged a fleeting, confused glance. They had seen Jae-hyun face down rival syndicates and federal raids without blinking. Yet here he was, looking as though he had been struck by a physical blow. Iva held her ground, her breath hitching as the powerful man neared. She expected a threat or a hand around her throat. Instead, she saw a man who looked like he was seeing a ghost rise from the asphalt. "You," Jae-hyun whispered, the word nearly lost to the rhythm of the rain. It wasn't the voice of a boss. It was the voice of a boy who had lost everything in a fire a decade and a half ago.
He didn't order her moved. He simply stood there in the middle of the storm, his power forgotten, staring at the bloodied woman as if her presence had rewritten the laws of his universe. The past he had buried under layers of iron and blood had just stepped into the light of his headlights, and for the first time in his life, Park Jae-yun had no idea what to do next. The silence that followed Jae-yun's whisper was more deafening than the storm. The rain lashed against the asphalt, splashing against the expensive leather of his shoes and the tattered hem of Iva's jeans. Yet the man who held the city in a velvet-gloved fist remained frozen. His lead bodyguard, a man named Min-ho, who had served the Park family for 2 decades, stepped forward cautiously. He kept his eyes on Iva, his hand hovering near the concealed holster beneath his tailored jacket. To him, this woman was a security breach, a bloodied anomaly that had caused his master to lose his composure. "Sir," Min-ho murmured, his voice low and urgent, barely audible over the wind. "The street is unsecured. We need to clear the path and move you to the secondary location. I'll have the men remove her." The men signaled to 2 other enforcers. They began to close in on Iva, their silhouettes massive and intimidating against the blue glow of the headlights. Iva didn't flinch, though her knuckles turned white as she gripped the blood-soaked cloth. She expected the rough hands, the cold concrete, and the familiar taste of the gutter. "Don't touch her." The command was quiet, but it sliced through the air with the sharpness of a razor. The bodyguards stopped mid-step, their training colliding with the sheer shock of Jae-yun's tone. He hadn't looked away from Iva's face. The paleness was still there, but it was being replaced by a terrifying, focused intensity. Jae-yun finally moved. He didn't move toward the car. He stepped closer to Iva, closing the distance until the warmth of the idling engines and the scent of his expensive cologne reached her. He looked at the hematoma on her cheek, then down at the crimson stains blooming across her white shirt. A dark, jagged vein throbbed in his temple. "Min-ho," Jae-yun said, his voice regaining his icy, authoritative edge, though it vibrated with an underlying current of suppressed rage. "Cancel the meeting with the syndicate. All of them, sir," Min-ho gasped, his professional mask slipping. "The treaty!" "I don't care about the treaty," Jae-yun snapped, his eyes flashing like flint. He turned his head just enough to address his crew, though his gaze quickly snapped back to Iva. "I want a full perimeter. Secure this block. Call the medical unit to the safe house."
No one, and I mean no one, gets within 100 yards of this woman. If a single person even looks at her with ill intent, I want their head. Am I clear? A ripple of disbelief went through the ranks. A full perimeter protect and secure was an apex-level protocol reserved only for the head of the family during active warfare. To waste such resources on a stranger found in a gutter was unheard of. It was more than a breach of protocol. It was an act of madness. "Move!" Jae-hyun roared when they hesitated. The enforcers scrambled. The stoic formation broke into a frantic, high-stakes choreography. Radios crackled with urgent Korean commands as the black sedans began to shift, repositioning themselves to form a steel fortress around the bloodied woman in the white shirt. Jae-hyun reached out, his hand hovering inches from Eva's arm, hesitant for the first time in his life.
"You're safe now," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I won't let them find you again." Eva looked at the man the city feared, seeing the ghost of a memory she couldn't quite place, and for the first time since the assault, her legs began to shake. She wasn't just being rescued, she was being claimed by a monster who looked like he had just found his soul. The interior of the lead sedan was a sensory overload of luxury and clinical stillness. Eva sat pressed against the heated leather seat, her body still trembling so violently that the fine vibrations of the car's engine felt like they were coming from her own bones. Outside, the world was a blur of rain and neon, but inside, the air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood and expensive cedar. Jae-hyun sat in the far corner of the spacious rear compartment, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the passing city lights. He hadn't spoken since they left the boulevard, but his gaze remained fixed on her, heavy and unreadable. The convoy swept through a pair of massive iron gates that looked like they belonged to a fortress rather than a residence. They pulled into a subterranean garage lined with polished white stone and guarded by men who stood with the same rigid, emotionless precision as those on the street. When the car door opened, Eva hesitated, her hand clutching the torn fabric of her shirt. She felt like an ink blot on a pristine canvas, a mess of blood and grime in a world of marble and glass. "It's all right," Jae-hyun said, his voice softer now, though it still carried the weight of a command. He stepped out first, offering a hand she didn't take. He led her through a private elevator into a penthouse that overlooked the entire weeping city. The space was minimalist and vast, filled with shadows and the soft hum of high-end climate control. In the center of the living area, a team of 2 women in medical scrubs waited silently beside a rolling cart of supplies. They bowed deeply as Jae-hyun entered, but they didn't look at Eva. They waited for his permission.
"Clean her wounds," Jae-hyun ordered, his eyes briefly flashing with a dark heat as they landed on the bruise swelling her jaw. "Use the best antiseptics. If she winces, you failed." Iva allowed herself to be guided to a chair, but her eyes never left Jae-hyun. He paced the far end of the room, a glass of amber liquid in his hand that he didn't drink. Every time she caught his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, he was looking at her with an expression that bordered on agony. "Why?" Iva finally managed to whisper, her voice raspy and broken. The medical staff paused, startled by the sound, but Jae-hyun stopped his pacing instantly. She looked around at the opulence, the armed men visible through the glass balcony, and the sheer power radiating from the man before her. "You don't know me. You found me in the street. People like you don't stop for people like me. Why am I here?" Jae-hyun turned fully to face her. The light from the city silhouetted behind him cast his face into deep shadow, making him look more like a myth than a man. He took a slow step toward her, the ice in his eyes melting into something dangerously vulnerable. "You think I don't know you, Iva," he said, her name sounding like a prayer in his mouth. "But I have been looking for those eyes in every crowd for 15 years. You aren't a stranger. You are the only reason I'm still a man and not just a ghost." Iva's heart hammered against her bruised ribs. She wanted to believe the safety he offered, to sink into the warmth of the penthouse and forget the alleyway. But as she looked at the tattoos peeking from his sleeves and the cold efficiency of his staff, she realized she hadn't just been rescued. She had been pulled into the center of a storm she didn't understand. She was safe from the bullies, but she was now in the hands of the man who owned the city, and his salvation felt like it might cost her everything. The penthouse was a tomb of silence, save for the rhythmic tapping of keys from the high-tech workstation set up in the corner of the expansive library. While the medical team finished dressing Iva's wounds in the other room, the air around Park Jae-hyun remained thick with a cold, ionizing tension. He stood by the window, his back to the room,
watching the rain wash over the city he ruled. In the reflection of the glass, his face was no longer pale. It was set in a mask of lethal, focused intent. Behind him, Min-ho and a younger man named Kenji worked with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. They didn't need a police report or a witness statement. They had the city's digital pulse. "I had the footage from the bodega on 4th, Kenji murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. "The city cameras were a blind spot, but the shopkeeper has a private feed. Enhancing now." Jae-hyun didn't turn around. "Show me."
The large monitors on the wall flickered to life, grainy and gray, showing the mouth of the alley. Iva appeared on screen, her pace hurried, her posture tense. Then 3 figures emerged from the shadows behind her. They were young, dressed in expensive streetwear that suggested they were the sons of men with too much money and too little discipline. The video had no sound, but the violence was deafening. The lead attacker, a tall man with a distinctive bleached blonde undercut, grabbed Iva by the hair. Jae-hyun's hand tightened around his glass until the crystal groaned. He watched the screen as the blonde man threw a punch that sent Iva to the pavement. He watched as they laughed. "Run the facial recognition through the university database and the private club registries," Jae-hyun commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "They aren't street thugs. They're predators who think they're protected by their father's shadows." "Already done, sir," Min-ho replied, stepping forward with a tablet. "The one with the blonde hair is Leo Vance. His father is a major shareholder in the city's logistics firm. The other 2 are his associates, Miller and Grant. They have a history of disappearing complaints made by women on campus." Jae-hyun finally turned. He walked over to the monitors, his eyes tracing the face of Leo Vance with the gaze of an executioner. "They think they're powerful because they have money. They think they are safe because they chose a victim they thought was alone." He leaned over the desk, his shadow falling across the faces of the 3 men on the screen. The blue light of the monitors caught the sharp edge of his jaw and the predatory stillness in his eyes. "Gather the shadows," Jae-hyun whispered. "I want to know where they sleep. I want to know what they love. I want to know the exact moment they realize that the woman they broke is the one thing in this world they weren't allowed to touch." "And the father, sir?" Min-ho asked, his hand poised to send the signal to their street teams. Jae-hyun looked back at the door where Iva was resting, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening into something indestructible. "If they stood by while their sons became monsters, then they can watch while I dismantle everything they've built. Start with the logistics firm. By sunrise, I want the Vance family to realize that their empire is built on sand and the tide has just come in." The command was sent. Across the city, phones began to vibrate in the pockets of men who moved in the dark. The hunt had begun, not for profit or territory, but for the soul of a man who had finally found a reason to burn the world down. The antiseptic scent of the medical dressings was slowly being replaced by the deep, grounding aroma of the tea the staff had left on the mahogany side table. Eva sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, her body no longer shaking, though a cold, hard knot of suspicion had formed in her chest. Across the room, Park Jae-yoon stood by the fireplace, his back to her, watching the embers die down. The power he radiated was suffocating, a reminder that she was in the lair of a man who moved the world with a whisper. Eva stood up, her legs stiff but steady. "I want to know the truth," she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the penthouse. Jae-yoon didn't move at first. You should rest, Eva, the doctor said. I don't care what the doctor said, she interrupted, taking a step toward him. I know who you are. I've seen your face on the news, linked to things people are too afraid to name. You're Park Jae-yoon. You're a ghost story told to keep people in line. So why are you playing the savior for a woman you found bleeding in the rain? Why the perimeter? Why the names? Jae-yoon finally turned. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw, but his eyes were lost in the shadows. I told you, I've been looking for you. That's not an answer. Eva's voice rose, fueled by the lingering adrenaline of the night. I grew up in the foster system of a city that didn't want me. I worked 3 jobs to get through a school where people like Leo Vance think I'm target practice. My life has been a series of closed doors and hard floors. There is no version of my story where a man like you is looking for me. So tell me the truth, or let me walk out that door right now. Jae-yoon reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small, weathered piece of paper, the edges frayed and yellowed by time. He walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. He held the paper out. Eva took it with a trembling hand. It was a photograph, old and cracked. It showed 2 children, a young black girl with a gap-toothed smile and a slightly older Korean boy with a protective arm slung around her shoulders. They were sitting on the steps of a dilapidated apartment complex that Eva recognized with a jolt of visceral memory. The fire at the Crescent Heights apartments, 15 years ago. Everyone said the family in 4B didn't make it out. My father's rivals set that fire to send a message. I was the boy you shared your lunch with every day behind the playground. I was the boy you pushed through the laundry chute when the smoke became too thick for both of us to breathe. Eva's breath hitched, a memory she had buried under layers of trauma, the smell of smoke, the heat of the metal chute, and the terrified boy who had promised to find her, rushed back with the force of a tidal wave.
I spent years thinking you were ashes, Jae-hyun whispered, stepping into the light. His eyes were wet, the iron mask of the Mafia boss completely gone. I built an empire out of blood and shadows so I would never be that helpless boy again. And then, tonight, I saw those same eyes looking at me through the rain. You saved my life once, Iva. I am not helping a stranger. I am finally, after 15 years, keeping my promise. The velvet silence of the penthouse was a world away from the neon-lit grit of the South Side, but the storm that had begun in Iva's heart was now being unleashed through the city's veins. In a high-end private club downtown, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the arrogance of untouchable youth. Leo Vance leaned back in a leather booth, a smirk playing on his lips as he recounted the night's entertainment to his 2 associates. To them, the woman in the white shirt had been nothing more than a momentary diversion, a way to feel powerful before the sun came up. She actually thought she could stand there and look at me? Leo laughed, swirling the ice in his glass, like she was someone. He didn't notice the music in the club suddenly cut out. He didn't see the patrons at the surrounding tables quietly standing up and heading for the exits, guided by men in sharp black suits who didn't say a word. It wasn't until the heavy oak doors of the VIP lounge clicked shut and locked that Leo looked up. Standing at the entrance was a wall of black silk and cold steel. Min Ho stood at the center, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. Behind him, a dozen enforcers fanned out, their shadows stretching long and predatory across the polished floor. "Who the hell are you?" Leo demanded, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain his bravado. "Do you know who my father is?"
Your father, Minho said, his voice a low, clinical rasp, is currently watching his life's work dissolve into a series of federal audits and frozen assets, but he is not our concern tonight. The two associates tried to bolt, but they were intercepted with a brutal, practiced efficiency. Within seconds, they were forced to their knees on the cold floor. Leo was left alone, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the circle of men closed in. The heavy oak doors opened once more. The sound of measured, expensive footsteps echoed in the hollow room. Park Jae-hyun stepped into the light, but he wasn't alone. Walking beside him, dressed in a clean, dark coat that covered her bandages, was Iva. She didn't look like the broken woman in the alleyway. She looked like a queen, standing beside her executioner. Jae-hyun didn't speak to Leo. He didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes on Iva, watching her face to see if she wanted justice or blood.
"Is this the hand?" Jae-hyun asked quietly, nodding toward Leo's right arm. Leo began to hyperventilate, the reality of his situation finally crashing down. These weren't campus security or local police. These were the ghosts that ran the city. "Please," he sobbed, his arrogance vanishing into a puddle of terrified tears. "It was just a mistake. We didn't know she was—" "You didn't know she was mine," Jae-hyun finished for him, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper. Iva stepped forward, her shadow falling over the man who had tried to break her. For years she had lived in fear of men like Leo Vance, but as she looked down at him, shivering on the floor of his own playground, she realized the power had shifted forever. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the witness to a retribution that had been 15 years in the making. "The world is different tonight, Leo," Iva said, her voice steady and cold, "and you're about to find out exactly how small you are." Jae-hyun placed a hand on Iva's shoulder, a silent promise of protection, before turning his gaze to Min-ho. He didn't need to say the words. The shadow of the Mafia had fallen, and for the men who had touched Iva Brighton, the sun would never rise again. The heavy, iron-scented air of the club felt different as Iva walked back toward the exit, her stride no longer hesitant. Behind her, the muffled sounds of the lounge being cleansed faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic clicking of her own heels on the marble. She wasn't the same woman who had crawled out of that alleyway. The bruises on her face were still there, but they no longer looked like marks of shame. They looked like the first scars of a war she was finally winning. Park Jae-hyun walked half a step behind her, a position of deference that sent shockwaves through the remaining guards stationed at the doors. He wasn't just her protector, he was her shadow, a silent engine of power waiting for her command. As they reached the sidewalk, the rain had slowed to a shimmering mist. The convoy stood waiting, engines idling in a low, predatory hum, the blue headlights cutting through the fog like beacons. "It's not over, is it?" Iva asked, stopping at the edge of the curb. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the neon lights of the city she used to fear. Leo Vance was just a symptom. Men like him only exist because the system allows them to. Jae-hyun looked at her, his expression a mixture of pride and a deep, haunting sorrow. "The board of directors for the logistics firm, the men who funded Leo's lifestyle and covered his tracks, are meeting tonight. They think they can distance themselves from the scandal before the sun rises. They think they can simply replace a few names and continue as they were."
Iva felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. She realized then that Jae-hyun wasn't just giving her revenge. He was giving her a seat at the table. He was offering her the chance to dismantle the very structure that had kept her small. "Then let's show them the truth," Iva said, her voice steady and resonant. "I don't want them just to lose their money. I want them to see the face of the person they thought didn't matter."
Jae-yoon reached out, and this time Iva took his hand. His grip was firm, a bridge between a forgotten past and a lethal future. "Then we go together," he whispered. "The boy from the fire and the girl from the chute. The city belongs to those who survive it." He opened the door of the lead sedan himself, ushering her into the seat of power. As the convoy pulled away from the curb, moving in a seamless, armored wave, the transformation was complete. Iva Brighton was no longer a victim of the South Side. She was the new variable in a dangerous equation, a woman of power, forged in blood and recognized by a king. Together, they disappeared into the heart of the city, two ghosts who had returned to claim everything that was once stolen from them. The night was no longer cold. For the first time in 15 years, Iva felt the warmth of a fire that wasn't burning her down. It was lighting her way.